This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And sponsored by Uber Creative Agency, a boutique web design, development, and marketing agency based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with clients across the U.S. We don't just provide services, we deliver value.
Welcome to the Lake Superior Podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara. We are made stronger by story, and there's no better source than the continent's largest body of fresh water, Lake Superior.
So join us as we highlight the 5 national parks that ring this greatest of the Great Lakes, meet the people, tour the places, and learn about the projects that make these parks and body of water so remarkable.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
I'm Walt Lindala.
And I'm Frida Waara.
Welcome once again to the Lake Superior Podcast. Today, Frida, talking about with somebody that has some very interesting stories about what's in our Great Lake of Lake Superior.
Absolutely, Walt. And you know what's about the fish? The fish are just so abundant. And we get to speak with the real expert about, not only because he's with the Michigan Department of Natural Resources, so we love that he's a hometown kind of guy, but his extensive knowledge of the Great Lakes and our deep water fisheries. So let's hear from Shawn Sitar.
Yeah, Shawn Sitar is here with us. He's with the Michigan DNR, a fisheries research biologist. Welcome to the podcast, Shawn.
Thanks for having me.
Well, let's kind of start off a little bit about your background. I mean, tell us a little bit about, did you grow up in the Great Lakes? Did you have any plans of getting involved with the Great Lakes? Tell us a little bit about your background and how you got to where you are today.
Okay, well, actually, I'm from out east. I grew up in northeast Pennsylvania, just outside of Scranton. And to be honest about the Great Lakes, it was just something I learned about in geography class. There were just a bunch of big lakes, almost in Canada. So to be honest, I knew nothing about the Great Lakes. As a child, I knew I wanted to be a biologist. I think many up here experience things that people growing up out east don't experience. People grow up hunting and fishing here. Out there is a different story. The resources are more depleted. But I was fortunate to grow up in the mountains of Pennsylvania, so my friends and I spent a lot of time in the woods, and my calling for biology kind of came from that. And then as I pursued college, I went to school in upstate New York, and actually a lot of my background was in plant ecology because my mentor was a plant ecologist, but I also was interested in serving in the military, so I kind of did both. Joined the Marine Corps Reserve and went to college, and then I had ambitions on being a Marine Corps officer. And then during my time in school, I actually got deployed to Desert Storm and kind of got my taste of military life. And I made a decision to decline my commission as an officer and pursued the biology path. And funny thing is I was looking to get into plant ecology and some other areas. And my mentor, who was a plant ecologist, said, well, you know, fisheries is an area that's pretty well funded and there's a lot of opportunity, so I just made a decision to go into fisheries, and that actually led me to Michigan. I applied to graduate school and got my master's at Michigan State. And my first project was actually working on Lake Huron, Lake Trout, or Lake Char. So I'll probably use the words interchangeably because Lake Trout are actually a char, which is a northern species. And they're well suited for Lake Superior, of course.
So tell us,
that's how I got here.
Yeah, tell us a little bit about how that led you to Lake Superior in particular then.
So I worked my way up. I've worked actually in all of the Great Lakes. During grad school, I helped develop some of the first population models to actually, I tell my kids I count fish, but actually in scientific talk, it's actually called stock assessment. So basically we're doing a heavy inventory, or what the Census Bureau does in inventorying the Great Lakes of important resources for the peoples. Because when I arrived, the 2000 consent decree was being implemented, which is an agreement between the Native American tribes and the state, and involves the federal government in terms of how natural resources are allocated. And so my part was in the Great Lakes. And so I worked in Lake Huron, and I did some time in Lake Michigan, studying populations there. I spent a little time in Lake Erie, which really is like the shallow end, or like a hot tub. And then eventually, I was working for the feds, and the state asked me to come work for them. My predecessor, the guy shoes I filled, was moved up to station manager here in Marquette for our research station. So asked me to come up, and I came up, and like most people that don't grow up here, I'm just thinking, well, do I need like dog sleds and things like that? The typical, because when I was in grad school in Lansing, I'm like, everybody asks people that live in the UP, like, do you have, power and stuff like that. So it was really a great, my moment of going into the bush to live or something like that. But then, I raised my family here. It's like, it's the best place in the Great Lakes in terms of working on the Great Lakes.
Is that how, Shawn, that you feel about Lake Superior? I mean, as a fisheries biologist, have you just landed in, Mecca?
Yes. Well, I know it's the biggest lake on Earth, but I actually have spent a lot of my life out there, and I did not realize the scale of things. So the type of work I do, so we have counterparts. The state has research stations on each of the Great Lakes, and Lake Sinclair is the one that covers Lake Erie. So I've worked with all of them, and the scale of work up here is a whole different level. So we have cold weather. The system is very cold. It's a very deep lake. So the operations we do in terms of deployment of gear and moving through the lake is just a whole other scale that actually now we've developed expertise, because a lot of our work offshore, no one else works in deep water as much as we do. So they look to my crew to kind of understand how to, understand the ecosystem in deeper areas. So it's been really a great experience. I did not realize, because a lot of science, especially inland systems, people have been through rivers, they know about lakes, but when you come out to this lake, it's actually a lot of it's not explored. And that actually a lot of my work, we've been fortunate to actually do discoveries, which, I was excited, because as a scientist, man, everybody answered everything. And it's not true. At least, the fun stuff that you think of as when you're younger in your career.
Shawn, it kind of leads me into thinking here that, if you're working with a lake as big and as deep as Lake Superior, this was for what you do as a research biologist with fisheries. You touch on discoveries. You talk about seeing things or finding things maybe that haven't been seen. Have you been in on some of those, and what have some of those perhaps meant for Great Lakes, the fisheries history?
Okay, so I'll touch on some of them. I'm the state's deep water fish specialist for Lake Superior. So it's basically dealing with lake trout and whitefish and some of the other species that are out there. And I guess to describe Lake Superior, if you go from the shoreline out to the middle of the lake, it's similar to going from biodiversity-wise from the equator to the Arctic. So there's a lot of species near shore, and actually the habitat, extremes are of a similar parallel. So when I give talks, I talk about, to understand the scale of this, you're talking about an extreme system where animals are very resilient and resourceful, and there's not much food out there. They're going to be very adaptive. And so we work from the shoreline out, and in deep water areas, there's just a lot of things that nobody gets out there, because it's very difficult to get out there. And some of the projects we have, it seems like a simple thing, but it takes a massive amount of logistics and planning because it's such a deep lake. The deepest part is 1,320 plus or minus feet. We actually been out there doing work, but to do that, nobody's done it in the Great Lakes. In the oceans, it's different, but the scientists that are trained in the Great Lakes mostly are trained in freshwater systems, and they're taught this concept of limnology, which is the study of lakes. But these are things you can see the bottom end, and you can see the plants go from the. You go out in the Lake Superior, you don't even see land out there, and the amount of pressure that's in the bottom of the lake, and there's no light down there, but there's still life. So it's kind of more like working in a mini ocean than it is a small lake. So the discoveries we've made, the 1,300-foot hole, our crew was actually the first one to find fish there. Funny thing, I was telling Frida when I first came on as a young scientist, like, well, I don't know what to do. Everything's been answered. And then one day I was asking, well, in the deep hole, what's out there? And everybody, all the scientists, and even it's like, well, there's probably, this form of lake trout, a deep water form called the ciskoet or vernacular sat. I said, well, are you sure? We're supposed to prove stuff. And I said, I don't know. So I sent my crew out, and it was a big expedition because we had a slower boat. It took us 3 hours to get out there, and then the crew never set nets in that deep because normally when you set nets, they're anchored to something so you don't spin them into a ball. But because it was so deep, we took miles and miles of line just to set the nets, and it was going to be free falling in that there was no place to anchor it. So the crew spent a lot of time. So I have a great assembled team of innovators and thinkers that can. You basically have to have that to have solutions with something that's unknown out there.
Yeah.
And our motto that I try to impress on the crew is that I don't know, but we're going to find out. And if not, we're at least going to try.
Yeah.
And that's a lot of this lake is there's parts of it that nobody's really done some of this work in. And so, we set nets and we found this deep water ecotype. And there's actually an mini ecosystem out there of different animals. I mean, they eat food, and we're like, wow, these things are out there. And, it's a lot of effort just to answer some basic questions. So it's pretty exciting.
We're talking with Shawn Sitar today, who is a Michigan DNR fisheries research biologist, about some of the fisheries information about Lake Superior. And it's quite a conversation so far.
And Shawn, you just have released a study at Isle Royale, and that one, we've got to let our listeners know a little bit as you talk about the logistics of what you are finding and also what you've discovered.
Oh, okay. So, I'll touch on that. So just let me touch on, so a lot of my work centers on lake trout, which is it's described in ecology as keystone predator. So it's like the wolf in an ecosystem. It provides a strong stability and regulating the lower part of the food web. So when you remove a predator, it's really destabilizes the ecosystem. So actually the Great Lakes, lake trout went extinct in all of the Great Lakes except Lake Superior.
Really?
And we're fortunate that there's a reservoir of this, native species that's still there. So I look at our job as studying this and providing information to recover them in the lower Great Lakes. And we're starting to see signs of recovery in the lower Great Lakes. But one of their questions is, what forms were in deep water? In Lake Superior, we have 4 ecotypes of lake trout. We have the conventional lean lake trout, which is what everybody sees as lake trout. Then there's the deep water form called the ciskoet or fat, and it's the most abundant form in Lake Superior, and it's actually the most interesting and versatile form. And then there's 2 more rare forms. One's called the humper, which lives on offshore humps or seamounts in the system. It's actually almost a pygmy form. And then there's the more recently described redfin, which is kind of in between. It's a pretty good-sized fish, and there's not a lot known about it. So we've been working on all of them. But Frida was mentioning this project at Isle Royale, and we've been working out there for about 15 years. And the reason we work at Isle Royale is that it's a real concentrated, great study environment of biodiversity. Because it's basically a seamount or an island area, we see all 4 forms right there. So we don't have to go all over the lake to look for these ecotypes. So we've been studying them out there for quite some time. And the recent study was this deep water ciskoet study. So one of the questions is nobody knows where these things lay their eggs. There's a lot of information on just the conventional lake trout. We know they spawn in reefs and near shore areas in about 80 down to like 20 feet. But nobody knows where ciskoet spawn. And we're like, well, they exist. I mean, how can they exist without eggs? So while working at Isle Royale, we actually discovered another special population of Siskoets while we were out there. Lake trout typically spawn in the fall throughout the Great Lakes, but we actually found a population on the north side of Isle Royale that spawns in the spring.
In the spring?
Deep water Siskoet form. Yes, in the spring and May. Mm-hmm. So that leads to when we were doing this project. So the Great Lakes Fishery Commission funded us, and we assembled an interdisciplinary team to go out and find out where Siskoet spawn. So it's basically a very expensive, deep underwater Easter egg hunt, essentially. So we had a 5-year project. So we knew where these spawners were based on the surveys I've done out there. And so there's a fall and a spring spawning population of Siskoet. So my crew knew how to catch these, and we knew where they were on Isle Royale. So we got that. And we brought in a specialist that do underwater telemetry. So in comparison to radio tags that you do with deer and elk and wolves,
sure,
which rely on radio waves, underwater, everything is based on sound waves. So it's more sophisticated and complex because of the physics of the water column. So they use underwater sonic tags in fish. In order to receive those signals, you have to have receivers, unless the U.S. Navy brings the sub or something like that.
Sure.
So we had to deploy, since these fish are in deep water, these fish were spawning in 100 meters or 400 feet and deeper. So these are definitely a deep form. And that's just like kind of the shallow end of the pool for this animal. As I mentioned, we found them at 1,300 feet. So we had to deploy the deepest acoustic array. We also had to do them underwater because they had to overwinter to collect data over the year, throughout the winter.
Yeah.
And we didn't want the ice to destroy all the buoys, and and we wanted, these are expensive receivers too, that we deployed about 100 in this grid around where we think they're spawning.
To me, Shawn, it seems like that is actually like there's a lot of information. I almost made a pun about saying the depth of information that you're getting out of this, but it tells me that this is the kind of work that really requires substantial planning, obviously, because you got to have all this technology, manage it, then be able to plan to put it somewhere, get there to put it wherever it is, and then get all the information and harvest all of that, and then put it all together. How do you plan for something like this? Like with this Isle Royale project in particular you're talking about, I mean, the planning, this is like a major expedition. This isn't just going and dropping a couple of sensors in the lake and getting a few things. Tell us about the planning for something like this.
Right. So so first, as a scientist, you have to have a hypothesis and scientific design. So you don't just go out and tag stuff and do stuff. So that's the rigor of science. You have to answer questions. So the question in scientific design was developed by our researchers. But yeah, the logistics. So I've been working with the National Park Service. The staff at Isle Royale are outstanding, and they have a great logistical support network to run the park. But they also have a science component. And so I've been working with the scientists out there for many years. And so I understood that the logistics out there were available, and we can get their assistance, and they're actually part of the study. So part of planning is to get the design of what we need to do and then assemble the team. So we had all the researchers assembled on the team, and a lot of this actually falls back on kind of my military planning. As a leader in the military, you're taught to do, planning of the mission, but there's also the spatial component. But the biggest part of planning these things are logistics and getting your assets aligned. And so having partnered with the park for many years and then understanding my team, we just knew we wanted who to bring in and the skill sets that would have. And then each stage of the study, we just drew on specialists. So in this case, the logistical planning was coordinate with the park, get the study area defined, and then, we had target zones to work in. And then, we just, you systematically lay this out with a timeline, and then always plan contingencies and then also fallbacks on the contingencies when things come up, because as you guys know, the weather and the system and also administrative things, and COVID was in the middle of this, all of these things can add constraints. So you always have fallback plans in your planning. But yeah, it was a great feat. those receivers actually be underwater. So I was telling Frida that we had to use special anchors because the conventional anchors that were used prior to this program were cement anchors, and there was concern by the park in that it would be an unnatural object in park waters. And so an elegant solution sometimes come when you have your whole team having input and, just you get the right minds together that are there, problem solvers. So my boat captain came up with the idea, well, why don't we use rocks? Because there's a lot of rocks out there. And so the park was, everybody thought that would make sense. And actually, it was actually better because the rocks we collected are high density versus concrete. So they're actually a smaller footprint to have on ships. So we actually hauled about 20,000 pounds of boulders, I think, out there. Because each time the receiver popped off, we had to use a new boulder. And, in the lake, it's the largest lake on Earth. They're a small footprint, but also it's environmentally sound. It's in the context of habitat that's already there, that's rocky. So it fits into there. But, yeah, we had to figure out how to do that, and here's where the park comes in. They actually have an old military LCM or a landing craft that they use to get heavy equipment out there. So they just took all these boulders out to the small island on the north side of Isle Royale for us, and then we just moved them on small vessels out and deployed them, and then just tended the array over the years. So yeah, it takes a lot of planning, and you got to have the right team of assets and heavy lift capabilities. And yeah, I mean, even in a remote site like Isle Royale, we were able to get this project done.
Just talking about being on the surface, where you're at. I've been around that North Shore. It's not friendly. And you're out there in May? I mean, the ice is just coming off the lake. That had to be crazy, Shawn.
Well, we spend a lot of time in the lake, and so we're pretty used to cold weather. So yeah, the team has had a lot of experience on working at the extremes of the open water season. So well, it's just nature, but unfortunately for us, a lot of the biology of these animals is either in the spring or in the late fall and the winter, and so we have to push those limits within some safe, with some safe contingencies to operate, and that's what this work is about. It's not working in a lab or office. This is the biggest lake on Earth, and we have to respect Mother Nature, so we have to do the best we can, and that's where a lot of innovation and things come up in terms of working at these extreme conditions.
And part of that extreme is also the depth. That's got to be amazing pressure when you're working with this equipment. Isn't necessarily bomb proof, I guess, but to go down that 400 feet in depth, that had to take some special engineering for sure.
Oh, yes. Yeah. And so the equipment we're the only ones that use we have special, so the nets we deploy have floats on them, and the floats we buy are from the oceans. They're not even the ones that most people use in the Great Lakes our crew is a lot of experience, and it's not a big deal for them to work in 1,000 feet or deeper.
Sure.
Most of the other agencies work in 300 feet or less. And so, like deep is a relative scale. But yeah, you're right. This lake is deep. At the deepest hole in the Great Lakes, it's 41 atmospheres of pressure.
Wow.
So aside from us getting stuff down there and the equipment we have to not get crushed, these animals live down there like it's nothing. So that's what's really impressive. And, it takes a bit of effort to understand, but yeah, that's what makes this system so amazing.
We're talking to Shawn Sitar today, who's Michigan DNR Fisheries Research Biologist here on our Lake Superior podcast today. Shawn, simple question, probably a good answer or a long answer or at least an in-depth answer. Once again, no pun intended. But why is this important? Why do we need to know this? Why is this something that is important from a research standpoint, but also from just an understanding standpoint?
So because the system is so large, a lot of things were not answered, and because it's so distant, sometimes it's not tangible to understand. But again, I mentioned earlier that the Lake Trout serves as the top predator in the system. So we've seen all the lower Great Lakes change in terms of their ecosystem, and a lot of catastrophic things have happened. So this lake is so pristine that it's important to study both things that we can see near shore. So even the lean lake trout, which most people harvest, those are tangible. They collect those. These deeper forms they may not see as often, but they also serve a role. So I've been trying to use this analogy in that the ecosystems have more tangible components. So let's just say it's a car engine. So it's pretty obvious that the key important parts are like the water pump or an engine. So those are obvious if they fail. But there's all these other things that the engineers put in there that are there for a reason. And in an ecosystem, when some of those are gone, it's less tangible to people that use consumptive things and resources. But there's these indirect things that are important, because in the long term, that engine's going to fail if you have some other component that you just throw off. Because why would they have that there unless you think there's some benefit in the long-term sustainability of that vehicle or engine? So it's the same with ecosystems. And so direct managements are things that we do and actions that agencies do with things that you eat directly or you can see. But all the food fishes, the plankton, the habitat, and these things in the Siskoet, for example, is another form of lake trout that may not be as valuable as leans, but they play an important role as those other components of the ecosystem. And with those removed, the system can be unstable, and you could lose what you're interested in.
Right.
So, for example, with Siskoets, so the sea lamprey is an invasive parasite that I think many are familiar with. It's a large eel-like thing that actually came from the Atlantic Ocean, and that's one of the most catastrophic things in the Great Lakes for fishes, in that it bores a hole through it and sucks its blood out and kills them.
Right.
Well, one thing that we're realizing is that Siskoets absorb a lot of sea lamprey attacks. In fact, they survive them better. They're tough, or we're not sure why. But if the Siskoets were not there, right, that not important part of the engine, where would those sea lamprey attacks go? They're going to probably increase on the fishes that we use directly. And so that's like a great example of what I would call indirect management of a resource. And that, well, it's important, and so we shouldn't just discount that.
Makes good sense to me. I'm curious about when you're talking about the balance of the systems and you're talking about these factors of like invasive species and such. We're hearing a lot about the concept of climate change, global warming, even the Great Lakes waters starting to get warmer. Is there any thoughts you have on that and how it could affect the fishery?
Well, just as my observation as a scientist, so when I started early in my career, a bit over 20 years ago, the surface water temperatures were much colder than they are now. Because we have some routine surveys that we do near shore, and so our ship's instruments measure surface temperatures all the time with our sampling stations. And I did some analyses, and yeah, it's definitely changed over time. So yeah, there are effects. I think Lake Superior of all the Great Lakes would be the most buffered, right? It's the deepest Great Lake. It's got a large volume and a large thermal capacity. So the effects are going to be delayed compared to the other Great Lakes. And we're already seeing some changes in the other Great Lakes and inland systems further south. In terms of Lake Superior, I think what we'll see may not be directly like with the species I study with whitefish and lake trout, but actually it would be the prey fishes and the other things around that, like with plankton, because a lot of that centers on temperature. So I think we may see some of that, and there's research going on with other agencies looking at these, what they call lower trophic or lower food web levels.
Sure.
And I think the first places we're going to see it is near shore areas where you actually can swim. If we start noticing that we can swim in Lake Superior early in the season all the time, you know, that's going to be an obvious indicator. But we are seeing some subtle indicators. And with biology and science and large systems like that, you know, a half a degree change is a bigger deal than what people would think.
Right.
So we are noticing some of that. So I think what we're documenting and studying will help map where we're at now and what's going to happen maybe in the future. That way we have kind of a place to look back to.
We're talking with Shawn Sitar today, who is the Michigan DNR Fisheries Research Biologist, talking about what's in the Great Lake of Lake Superior on our podcast today.
You know, Shawn, when you were talking about climate change, it was fascinating to me last August when I was at the Apostles and there was swimmer's itch. I never, ever experienced that in all my years. So, yep, there's those near shore areas. Are you doing any work over at the Apostles or at Pictured Rocks, the other two of our parks that are right on the water?
So my colleagues, there are counterparts to me that work in Wisconsin water. So I work for Michigan. I do work over in Wisconsin a little bit on some small projects. My colleagues are actually studying around Apostle Island. The Wisconsin DNR, the Red Cliff tribe over there, they're doing extensive work that are basically a mirror of what I'm doing. So they are monitoring things there. My crew, we do work off of Pictured Rocks, but again, we kind of work a little bit deeper. And I know some of the park personnel work in the rivers, and we have some nearshore biologists that work with coasters and other species in the river. So yeah, we have some work around there, but we are, our crew, we've got at least the deeper areas off of Pictured Rocks covered and around Grand Island, and all the way into like Grand Marais.
Sure.
I haven't had any projects with Pictured Rocks yet, but that could be down the road if a good question comes up. I really enjoy working with the national parks. It's a really good partnership when we get some of these projects done because they, a lot of good things are preserved in their systems, and they have a good logistical support network. And they also have a science component. So yeah, it's great.
And that's one of the missions of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, who sponsors this podcast. We like to be involved with this kind of work, and that's don't hesitate to stay in touch with us, Shawn, and happy to work with you. And from your work at Isle Royale that Phyllis Green, who was the former superintendent and worked very hard on ballast water in the Great Lakes, she's now also on the board of directors with the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. So we can keep that circle, keep the family definitely on target for helping.
Yeah, I'm really pleased to hear that. And actually, it's funny you mentioned family. I was reflecting on my career and just like coming here and not knowing anything about the lake. And I was telling Frida that I just realized, like, if I were to put a hometown, because I've moved around my life, but if I were to put a hometown, I would just put Lake Superior because I feel very connected to it. I've suffered a lot on it, but but all of the great things. I've been all over this lake. I am so fortunate with some of our projects. I was telling Frida we had a satellite tag project where some of the tags showed up in northern Lake Superior, and I had no idea what was up there. We went up there to work with my Canadian colleagues, so they helped us get out there. And, there's caribou on some of the Slate Islands up there. I'm like, holy cow, there's a lot to this lake that, again, a lot to explore.
Shawn, that's probably a good way to kind of cap it off for us today, because you have really opened up, I think, for a lot of our listeners, the ears to the fact that we talk about Lake Superior a lot of times from a recreational or sort of at least getting out on the water or seeing it, being on it, from more of an enjoyment standpoint. And you've really given us some insight today into what's under the surface and also how you're keeping tabs of it. And we certainly appreciate your time today. This has been really very interesting.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. I look at my job, as I'm here to help, and I'm excited that I get to work in such a beautiful system that has a lot of opportunities for exploration for whatever you do.
Well, we appreciate your update and time with us today on the podcast, and best of luck out there, and certainly hope we get a chance to talk with you again.
Yeah, stay very safe on that big blue, Shawn.
Stay safe
on that big blue.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, Shawn, thanks, man. We will talk with you sometime soon. Thanks for joining us today.
All right, take care. Thank you.
That is Shawn Sitar, who is Michigan DNR Fisheries Research Biologist. Frida, that was just some really interesting conversation about, we talk about the lake in terms of our interaction with it on the surface. It's nice to know what's underneath, too.
It's fascinating to understand that lake trout were extinct in all the other Great Lakes, but survived in Lake Superior. And now the work that Shawn's doing in understanding that there is a spring spawning for the Siskiwit at that depth. And, for something to live at that depth is amazing. And yeah, I I know Shawn enough that we ski together, and he's a big fan of Amundsen and Shackleton, which is, our polar explorers
He's a man of exploration and understanding that.
He's applying it in his job. He's never going to say never.
That's true. In fact, he says, let's just go try. That's the way he looks at it. Well, that's going to wrap it up for us on this latest edition of the Lake Superior podcast. Again, if you have some ideas, find us through wherever you get your podcasts. Also, you can reach out to the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation. We'd be happy to hear from you, and we will hopefully have you join us again for the next edition of the Lake Superior podcast. I'm Walt Lindala.
I'm Frida Waara. Thanks for listening. The National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation, NPLSF, is the only official nonprofit 501c3 fundraising partner of the National Park Service for all 5 U.S. national park sites on Lake Superior.
To learn more about NPLSF projects and programs, you can visit the website at nplsf.org or friend them on Facebook.
I'm Frida Waara.
And I'm Walt Lindala. Thanks for listening to the Lake Superior podcast.
This podcast made possible with the support of the National Parks of Lake Superior Foundation and Media Brew Communications.
This episode brought to you by Cafe Imports, Minneapolis-based importers of fine specialty green coffees. Independently owned and operated since 1993, Cafe Imports has been dedicated to decreasing its impact on the earth through renewable energy, carbon neutrality, and by supporting conservational efforts in places where quality coffee is grown and also where quality coffee is consumed. Where does your coffee come from?
And sponsored by Uber Creative Agency, a boutique web design, development, and marketing agency based in Minneapolis, Minnesota, with clients across the U.S. We don't just provide services, we deliver value.